Yeah.
Not without.
Otherwise you would have over the weekend. Yeah. Something made a porch. Yeah, there's something going on.
Right, we're ready. Okay then.
Right, enjoy everyone. See you later.
Okay, well, welcome. Do we have oh yes, it got very hot last week. With that high-tech door. Thank you. Right, well, let me get where I can actually see what I'm talking about. Okay, so we did some ancient history last time, introduction to Weston, and what I want to do today is just look at Weston as a village leading up to the time when it became a resort. And interestingly, we had a couple of decades when it was a resort, but before the railway came. So the sort of people who could afford to come here were clearly not the day tripper type. They had money to spare. So really, I'm talking about two kings. The one on the left was a local farmer king, and the one on the right was the king of transport, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And between them, I think they are the bookends of Weston's great change. Weston embracing the new world with tourism, and in 1842 Weston becomes a town. So I'm going to talk about it up until that particular year when we changed. So let's have a bit of a look back at the end of the village days. That phrase, good old days, sort of, because as I said last week, some people think anything in the past was good and anything in the future is bad. But it certainly was a very sleepy village because nobody really came here. It was self-sufficient, it looked after itself. People wandered from here to Bristol to market. They certainly took fish to market, they took fowl to market, and they took feathers to market. But beyond that, nothing much happened here to upset anyone. So I'm using a lot of illustrations which we actually have in the museum, so they're original works. And this is an 1832 sketch of the rectory, which is now Glebe House, and Grove House. And it changed. The one on the left is Glebe House, the one on the right is Grove House. The one on the left is much older. 1834 it was enlarged by the rector, who was also archdeacon, who was also the son of the bishop. So that's the way it worked in those days. He was also the cousin of Lord Ellenborough Crescent, Viceroy of India. So clergy then were not hard up for a bob or two. I don't know about clergy nowadays, but
Still harder.
unless they were poorly paid curates who were paid a pittance to look after the parishes when the rectors couldn't be bothered. But here we have this pleasant enough sketch of what today we would call Grove Park. And again, an aerial shot here. You can see this is last year's graduation ceremony. Everybody in gowns and mortarboards parading into St John's. And the house, which was the rectory, now Glebe House, is there on the right, and you can see right next to the church, which is the usual place where the parsonage house was to be found. Not quite the same nowadays, because you tend to find in villages the big rectories have been sold, and the poor parson is now forced to live in a smaller house some distance away from the church. That's the usual pattern nowadays. Grove House, it started off, it certainly wasn't called Grove House. It was just called The Grove, and this is where the Piggott family, later the Smith Pigotts, who lived in Brockley Court, had what we would call today a seaside cottage. And they would just come down in their carriage to Weston, and they had this little house in what today is Grove Park, and Grove Park was their garden, and this is where they would spend the summer, just enjoying themselves in the salubrious fresh air and sunshine of Weston-super-Mare. The house, of course, then morphed into a much grander Victorian manor house. As the Smith Piggott family chose increasingly to spend most of their time living in Weston rather than in Brockley Court, and so Weston became the seat of the manorial power. And this is an engraving. Wonderful way that engravers and artists sucked up to their betters. To John Hugh Smith-Pigott, Esquire, Lord of the Manor of Weston-super-Mare, this view is, by permission, most respectfully inscribed by his obedient servant, the publisher. It's like writing to newspapers. You always ended, I am your obedient servant, etc. Who would write to the Western Mercury nowadays in that vein? And the house was very much, and I'm not going to deal with it this week because we're really talking about the village. The house went on to be quite a glittering social centre in Weston-super-Mare, with some famous artists and poets coming to spend time here. The Smith-Pigott family, I mean, they're worth a lecture on their own. They're completely and utterly bonkers, inbred, mad, and were the cause of Parliament having to pass the Clergy Disciplinary Act in 1898, giving bishops the ability to sack clergymen of the Church of England for, quote, conduct unbecoming. But you're a rather sensitive audience, so I think I would have to avoid telling you why. But if you want to Google some fascinating stuff, just Google the abode of love, Spaxton, and it'll tell you all about it. It's a very raunchy thing. And Grove, when the family moved out at the end of the 19th century, they'd completely mucked up their financial estates. The house became a municipal house, so it morphed from being a manor house into our first public library, and then a cafe, and then the town clerk lived there. Then nobody quite knew what to do with it. Hitler knew what to do with it, dropped a bomb on it, and most of it was lost. So the bit we see now, the right-hand bit, is all that's left of the old village manor house. Funnily enough, or ironically enough, that bit is the newest part of the old house. And in 1958, the rather incongruous bungalow single-storey extension was added when it was the office of the park superintendent, and now it's the mayor's parlour. So, some interesting, not many, but there were some interesting sketches of that era. There was a local builder, John Gregory. He was a builder and carpenter, and he made this sketch in 1824, and you can see I've annotated it. That's St John's Church. He must have done this the day or the year the new church was built, because the medieval church was taken down in 1824 and the new church built. And this is the new church. So I think he'd probably sketched it to celebrate the new building. And on the right-hand side you can see the rectory and then Grove House. I've tried to identify the cottage in the foreground. It's certainly not the thatched cottage. There was a cottage between the thatched cottage and St John's, which was lived in by Mr Shepherd, and I think that's his cottage, but I can't be absolutely sure. This is the thatched cottage. Now, it's a terribly romantic cottage. It wasn't built for a local person. It was built for somebody who wanted to come here and spend his time composing, writing, reading, and just overlooking the sea. And so this became his country cottage. It was built for the Reverend William Leaves, who was the rector of Rington. And this is the man, Lieutenant William Leaves, to start with. He was a composer, poet, army officer. Then he became a priest and became rector of Rington. And the book on the right, it's one of his creations, Old Robin Gray, quite famous composition. He didn't spend much time in Rington. This is the church, very famous, superb Somerset church. He paid a curate to look after the curing of the souls of Rington, whilst he spent most of his time in Weston-super-Mare hobnobbing with writers and artists. But he went back to Rington to be buried. So here is his memorial, and he's buried under the high altar, as behoves a wealthy parson, rather than being incarcerated in the churchyard. The house has changed quite a lot, of course. There's very little of the original thatch cottage still there. And you can see this shot towards the end of the 19th century. It was a dairy, a house and a dairy. And then a bit later on, it changes its name to the Promenade Cafe. And that wonderful car, I mean, that is a posed car, isn't it? It's there just for this photograph. So it may well be the owner is taking the photograph, or the owner's in the cafe, who knows. But it hasn't changed that much between then and now, has it? And that's it today. They put up the sign saying 1774. I'm not sure that's absolutely spot on, but it's certainly of that era. And maps are a very important way of trying to work out what a place was like. Now we do have to be careful, because though the Ordnance Survey maps today are 100% accurate, I mean, we gave the world three things. We gave the world a civil service, we gave the world a railway network, and we gave the world jolly good maps. And there's nothing to beat Ordnance Survey map. But this is not an Ordnance Survey map. It was drawn up in 1806, and so there may be a bit of discrepancy. But we can see the roads which were here and are still here. Those roads in red. For those, I don't know how clear it is, but this is the road from Bristol into Weston. Remember, you couldn't come along what we now call Locking Road. You were constantly underwater. So you would have gone up the Scores and along the top road through Upper Milton, Upper Ashcombe, and then dropped down into Weston on the road that was appropriately known as the Bristol Road, which it still is. Down to meet High Street there. And where the YMCA is there was a farm, and a track went up to the Tor Field, to what today, or what a bit later became the Town Quarry there. This is the Grove, and then the main street, which was simply known as the Street, went down to what is now Big Lamp Corner, and another little street went off to the beach known as Watersill Lane, now Regent Street. Another one called West Lane, now West Street, went there. And this branched off to the Orchard and the Meadow, Orchard Street, Meadow Street, and this wandered off past the Wall Close Corner, Watersill Road, and then just petered out on the moor. And that today would be Locking Road. So this is Weston. Up on the hill, the medieval field system carried on. And we've got these four names: the West Tyming, the West Field, the Tor Field, and the East Field. And the only one which is with us by name is, of course, Eastfield. Eastfield Park, Eastfield Gardens, that is the old Eastfield. And this is where medieval strip farming would have taken place. All controlled, of course, by the Lord of the Manor. And then Weston-super-Mare Hill was the open grazing land where people could exercise their animals, collect their wood, if there was any. And all of that changed with the Enclosure Act of 1810. So here I've simply annotated the streets which are there today. Looking in, homing in on it a bit more, this today is our Big Lamp Corner, where Silica or the Carrot is, the street, and you can see these individual buildings are identified. And if we look at one in particular here, this today would be Orchard Place, that is Meadow Street, and this is where it was known as the Old Farmhouse. Now, at one stage it must have been the New Farmhouse, but it's only ever been known as the Old Farmhouse, and that is it. So if you can imagine, here you are walking down Orchard Place looking at that farmhouse. We've only got this picture of it and the back of it because somebody wrote a book and an illustrative guide, and we've got those two pictures of it, and I've just sort of colour coded a bit to make it easier to see on the screen. This is where it was, in Orchard Place. And these are the people who live there. This is Hannah, Hannah, the farmer's niece. Person writing this is a Londoner coming down really to take the mickey out of our Somerset dialect. And Vic, old Farmer King. So there's Farmer King, and there's his niece. And then Vic B. Varmer's wife, and Vic B. Tim, the labourer and manservant. So if they had a manservant, well, they weren't hard up for a poverty. They wouldn't have been wealthy, but they could certainly afford to have a manservant. And this is the person who wrote the book, Charlotte Wilson, 1826. She came down to Weston and she caught a stagecoach from Bath, because it's pre-railway, and arrives at Weston-super-Mare. And then a bit later on, she wrote her reminiscences of it. And so we've got this wonderful book. I've got a copy of it. When you think all of this is 15 years before the railway arrived, so that's interesting. And here is part of the text, which is worth reading. In the year 1826, I visited Bath for the benefit of the waters. How many of you have been to Bath and benefited by those awful sulphurous things which we all drink once to say we've done it? I mean, how on earth people could drink that and assume it's good for their health? Advertising, of course. After a sojournment of 4 months there, my medical advisor recommended me to spend a few weeks at Weston-super-Mare. The village then, for it has since become a place of fashionable resort, consisted of only 4 streets, 2 inns and a few scattered houses, some of which had been newly built by the rustic inhabitants of Weston, who themselves resided in small cottages with mould or stone floors. On our arrival there, myself and another, the place was full, not a lodging to let. We were encumbered with luggage and the stage would not before tomorrow return to Bath. Our situation was truly perplexing. The day too was intensely hot, which, and this is amusing, which rendered our wanderings over the deep burning sand on the beach very like wanderings in the land of Egypt. Yeah, I mean, when we talk of trying to sell Weston-super-Mare, I mean, this is the way to do it. At last, a young woman belonging to a small cottage, compassionating our case, very kindly took us to an old dame who was, I presume, principal gossip of the place. She was holding a cabinet with 4 other gossips when we were ushered into her presence. Our tale was told, and we, like strange animals, were stared at by the whole group. Now, of course, you imagine, you couldn't book ahead. You took a chance, you get on a stagecoach in Bath, you come to Weston-super-Mare, no lodgings are arranged, there are no hotels, and you just turn here and try to find somewhere to put up. So it's a bit like sort of, I don't know, RBR, what's it called? Yes. She then goes on. We soon made treaty for a whitewashed room in Mr. King's farm, with a little casement window considerably lower than my head, and a door secured only by a wooden button. I must not omit to say that our landlord had another house on the beach to furnish, which for the summer season the old farm had been stripped of a great part of its furniture and most of its kitchen utensils. At first I found some difficulty in understanding the broad Somersetshire dialect of the good folk at the farm, and they at times were as much puzzled to comprehend me. I had never before been 40 miles from London. Consequently, the art of making butter and cheese was to me very interesting. I was delighted with the novelty of the scene, and even attempted, in an ambitious rusticating mood, to milk a cow, but Collie cast, I thought, an ungracious glance at me. So I resigned my seat at the pail to the farmer's niece Hannah, who was her regular attender. I was pleased and amused at the simplicity of the honest rustics. To make myself acquainted with whose occupation and manners, I often left my own apartment to join the old dame in the cheese room or the parlour. So here's this sophisticated woman coming down from London, having sojourned in Bath, then coming on to Weston-super-Mare, and by the way she writes this book, actually quite enjoying her stay here. Completely different experience. Heaven knows what she was able to talk about when she went back to London. But it's a nice way of thinking how they came down to Weston. So, looking at what Weston was like in about 1800, I reckon we've got this sort of circle of occupations. Farming, we certainly know from the records, cattle, sheep, beef, fowl, vegetables, apples, blackberries, watercress, samphire. Now, if you want samphire today, all you have to do is go in season to the mouth of the River Axe, and you can pick as much samphire as you like when the tide is out. And I've picked carrier bags of it. If you take it to expensive restaurants, they will give you a fortune. This is. You know, you're going to Tesco for a bag of samphire, and going to an upmarket restaurant, and that's it grows in Weston-super-Mare. But you have to wash it quite often quite frequently to get rid of the salt.
Start up a business.
And then you just steam it, a bit like asparagus, cut them, and it's delicious. So there was the Weston samphire, and goose feathers. We sent the goose feathers to Bristol for eiderdowns, for pillows, for mattresses, blankets, for eiderdowns. So that's what people were doing in Weston. They were also fishing. And the fish here, salmon, cod, sprat eel, flounder, shrimp, dab and skate. Local people got fed up eating so much salmon. This is not farmed Scottish stuff that comes from the farm in Scotland, but this is good Atlantic salmon. People in Weston didn't really starve because there was much more fish to be had than is to be had today. About 150 people living in Weston, something around about 35 families. So obviously everybody knew everybody. I mean, if we all represented a family, that would be the entirety of Weston-super-Mare. We also farmed for teasels, which were used in the days before the Industrial Revolution. Teasels were used to card cloth. Then once industry started, the teasel carding just fell. It almost collapsed overnight. Herb gathering, that was quite important locally. And I'm always amazed. In Weston-super-Mare, rosemary grows everywhere and bay grows everywhere. And people will still go to Tesco and pay 90 pence for a silly little thing that size when you just walk down the street and pick it. It grows everywhere. So herb gathering was something. Mining, as I mentioned last week, at Milton, Whirl, and that came to an end. Didn't really come to an end until the 1920s. So we were a bit of an industrial centre as well. Even gathering seaweed, which was used for fertiliser, and still proper gardeners nowadays, or people who are environmentally conscious, will use seaweed for their fertiliser. And it was used in the Bristol glassworks for the potash. Transport. We were fishing huge amounts of fish. How did we get fish to market in Bristol? It must have been taken by boat, but nobody knows from where. It wouldn't have been taken up by land, it was just too difficult. But where the boats would have cast off, we don't really know. And then of course that last occupation, which is well known to all coastal resorts, smuggling. So local farms, if they needed to grind their corn, would have used the local windmills. Whirl had a mill that had been rebuilt in 1765 and it's still there. We call it the Observatory. Weston Mill was above the town quarry, and that had gone by the late 18th century. Uphill Mill was derelict in 1792, but it's still there. It's now an observation tower. And the mill in Moor Lane was converted, it's part of a house now, and that's still there. So these were the local windmills. And here's a nice picture, a rather romanticised picture of Whirl Mill. It was referred to in the museum as Uphill Windmill. It's not. It's definitely Whirl. You can see the Mendip Hills in the distance there. So let's have a look at how tourism starts. I reckon about 1780 it sort of begins in earnest. But it's homespun tourism. It's not foreigners coming here, and it's not us going there. It's about people coming. And every time there was a conflict in Europe, particularly between us and the French, it did the home tourist industry a power of good, because the wealthy could no longer afford, both financially or more importantly from their own security, they couldn't afford to go into the French waters or cross France, and so the local people rather liked it when France was being difficult, because it developed our own tourist industry. But it certainly wasn't this sort of industry. That it was some time before this one developed. We can go right back actually to Charles II. The apothecaries, the scientists, were coming here to collect various herbs. So here we are with the King's apothecary coming to Weston-super-Mare to pick things from the walls of Weston to use in their medicines. And Weston became quite a hub for all of these sorts of people. You see the botanists, geologists, painters, philosophers, archaeologists, historians, writers, musicians, clergymen and healers. Not exclusively Weston, but the sea was beginning to attract the romantics. We were having a different way of looking on things. And also people were becoming very much more interested in why things occurred, rather than being told that the world had been created according to Old Testament biblical stories. Science was becoming of interest. And this is carried right on. I mean, here we are in University Centre Weston. Warren Storey, who was the previous head of the School of Art, a very, very good artist, and this is one of his paintings of Anchor Head. Really, really good artist. So, you could actually come to Weston for the waters. You didn't actually have to go to Bath. And there were a few places where spring waters were consumed. Grove House, there was spring water there. Devonshire Cottage, long since gone. Cairo Hotel, long since gone. But if you start to go up Highbury Hill, where a new building site is on the left-hand side, the cranes and the things are going up, that's where there was a well, and it was fresh water. And people could go and drink this mineral water when the tide was out, but not when the tide was coming in, because it obviously brought salt water in and interfered with the quality of that water. And then at Spring Cove, we had what was known as the Dripping Well Cave. And I mentioned last week, this is where the Iron Age people on Welbury Hill got their fresh water. And that was lost in a landslide fairly recently, not until the late 19th century. Interesting, I mean, the water must still be coming down somewhere, but it's not dripping out any longer. And if it were, I mean, people pay a fortune for bottled water. We could be onto a winner here. I mean, you go into Tesco and pay for Tesco's own water, which probably comes out of the tap. Oops, no, I'm being recorded. It probably doesn't come out of the tap. Oh dear. But here's some nice pictures, again from the museum collection, of Weston before it developed. I mean, here you can see, you can see here Nightstone Island, when it was an island. This is the headland, so around the corner to Birnbach, steep holm there, and Breen down there. And this is the foreshore. No buildings. This is the whole of Weston seafront. You imagine you could walk from Weston along the beach all the way down to Uphill, and the sand dunes would have gone much further inland than they do currently. So it would have been a very romantic thing. And if you were interested in painting and the great outdoors, Turner came to this part of the coast, not actually to Weston, but certainly Clevedon, and this was a very popular area for painters. Here's another, a sketch, and I've homed in on part of it. If we look down, we can pick out the parish church, the sea, the thatched cottage. This is the track down to the High Street there, leading down to Watersill Lane there, and just these farms dotted around. Now it's a fairly naive picture, but it's wonderful. If you look in detail, you can actually locate particular buildings. And this print, the first promenade. Now it's interesting, we built our first promenade before Weston became a town, before the railway arrived. And this rather grand print, it's actually after the railway arrived, but the dates are quite interesting. 1814, if you can't see the back, I'll read. 20 guineas set aside to cover the dunes by Watersill Road, today's Regent Street, with clay to stop the sand blowing everywhere. People in Weston were beginning to complain about the amount of sand blowing on their thatched roofs and the houses collapsing under the weight of the sand. And they got really fed up with this. Now, who was responsible for improvement? Well, nobody, other than the church warden, and they would raise a rate. And so 20 guineas was actually collected with the idea that they would simply get mud from the sea and put it on top of the sand dunes. And that would hold the sand there. The sand dunes that we still have at Uphill, remember, came all the way up to Knightstone. They were 40 feet high. And that's what kept Weston from being flooded by the sea. We relied on that line of dunes to keep Weston free of flooding. Then in 1826, some of these dunes were actually flattened. A footpath was built, and then in 1829 that footpath was extended. The footpath started up at this end by Knightstone, came down towards what is now the Thatched Cottage, and then came down towards Regent Street. And it wasn't until 1885, much later on, that the present promenade was built. And here you can see a very nice watercolour of Knightstone Island as an island. We're still talking about pre-railway, 1820. Two people, Howe and Taylor. One is a parasol umbrella maker, but they saw potential. They took over the island and built a bathhouse on it, so people would come to have a cold water plunge or a hot water bath or a seaweed bath. There was a pool there, and then it was sold to the Reverend Thomas Pruin. But then in 1828 it really changed hands for considerable improvement when Dr. Edward Long-Fox bought it. Edward Long-Fox, of course, the great Bristol doctor, philanthropist, person who came up with the crazy idea that people suffering from mental problems shouldn't necessarily be incarcerated in asylums, but they should benefit from fresh air and openness. He was way ahead of his time. And so here in Weston-super-Mare, he established a therapeutic bathhouse, which is still there, Dr. Fox's bathhouse, and his name is immortalised in the Long-Fox unit at the hospital in Weston. So here on Knightstone Island is where it all began. And here's a wonderful quote, 1836, somebody who's come to stay in Weston, and she said, "Before breakfast, Mr. Lawrence and I walked to the Knightstone baths, where I had a cold shower for the second time, having commenced a series of 7 baths on the Saturday preceding. Selina had a tepid bath at the same place at the temperature of 98 degrees, preparatory to bathing in the open sea, which she is to begin to do daily on Wednesday." Now, you weren't supposed to go into the sea after lunch. You went into the sea before lunch. Nobody went into the sea after lunch. It was generally thought that if you bathed after you had eaten, you would go blah, 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 down you would go. In fact, I remember my dad always telling me to not go swimming unless I had fully digested my food 3 hours. Yeah. All the science nowadays says that's absolute bunkum, absolute nonsense. But you know, there we are. So there's this person taking her shower. The cost was pretty high. I mean, 3 shillings for a salt bath. I've worked it out, that would be about £8.60 today. Still not that much. I mean, if you go to the new bath at Bath, one on the roof, you're paying 40 quid, aren't you, to get in for a day there? But you know, it's great. But when you compare it with what people earned then, and that would have been 1/3 of a labourer's weekly wage. So the only people who could avail themselves of these facilities were the sort of people who were wealthy. Mind you, I dare say the local fishermen weren't interested in going for a saltwater bath. I mean, they were in the sea all the time in any case. Dr. Fox later on 1828, he spent the equivalent of £2.5 million today, creating the much enlarged bathhouse, which is still there, and then the hotel to accommodate people. That, of course, all changed at the beginning of the 20th century when the baths, the municipal swimming baths and theatre were built. In the town, we had other bathing, or in the village, other bathing facilities. Anyone know where this is? Of course you do.
Old post office.
There it is, still there. It's Old Post Office Lane, just off the northern bit of High Street, opposite the Playhouse. Well, here we have hot and cold plunging and shower baths, commodiously fitted up under the superintendence of Mrs. Jane Gill, one of the original bathing women of the place. And you can see it wasn't very sophisticated. The shower consisted of a man standing on a ladder, tipping a bucket of water. It's a stunningly interesting bit of architecture, still there, hopelessly uncared for, and part of the closed pub behind it. What potential! And just a few shots to show what it was like here. Not sure. I think this is what was then Glentworth Bay, now Marine Lake. 1824. The boats just come up. Here's another interesting sketch, 1826. Again, you can see Knightstone Island here. Okay, Wales looks a little closer than, but there's the church, and this would be the thatch cottage, and this is the village, and you can see the bathhouse is there, and this is Claremont House, just up on the hillside there. Oh, and let's go back. I've just spotted something. That's a salmon net, isn't it? Or shrimp net. Yes, got a shrimp net there. And in more detail, I've just homed in on, so you can see a bit more. I'm not sure Worldbury Hill is quite that steep, but you're right, it's all we have. And here's a lovely painting by S. Jackson, I don't know, male or female, 1840. You can see this is what today would be Marine Lake, but it's then Glentworth Bay, a natural shingle bay. And you can see the bathhouse behind and the hotel, Arthur's Tower, which has been, that was all lost in a fire. And of course, people didn't pretend that Westland was a nice blue sea. It's only in modern days when we started sending postcards where the sea had been painted. And everybody knows the sea goes out a long way, the sea is estuarial, therefore the colour is at times not inviting, and we have a wide expanse of mud. We know that, we've always known that. But the sea can be pretty unloving, can't it? And if people choose to leave their cars where they shouldn't, well, hey ho, that's the end of the engine. And it can be delightfully ferocious. We're living on the coast, and at times there have been some really serious floods. I mean, this is 1607. Geographers are still, we're not quite sure whether it was a tsunami. The scientific jury is still out on that. It might have been a tsunami, might have been just a combination of all sorts of things, but it was a severe flood. I mean, many hundreds were drowned in this area. And this is Kingston Seymour Church. And if you go to the church today, there's still a mark up here on the church wall where that flood came in. So a lot of people would have lost their lives. And look at that. This is a woodcut of the time. You can see what's going on. Whether that baby in the cot actually survived or not, I don't know. And the storms, I mean, this is Knightstone Causeway, 1903, when the sea breached it and one person died there. And of course the bathing machines. This is the way that the people went into the sea. They were destroyed in 1903, and they never ever were used again in Weston. So 1903, the end of Weston's bathing machines. And even in much more recent times, 1981, when the 1930s overhang of Marine Lake was literally lifted off its stilts and then crashed back down again. But that was an ill wind which actually produced some good, because a huge amount of government money was then pumped into Weston to rebuild the area around Marine Lake, and we have a much more attractive frontage to it now than we did then. And you can see there. But that was just the power of the waves. But then when the tide is out, we used to bring coal in from Wales to Weston by ship. And the ships would come in and they would drop their coal at Knightstone, and then they would just keel over and wait for the tide to come back in, and then keel back up again. That was the norm. So the waters have been used for all sorts of things, for bathing, fishing and smuggling. The boat bottom right is the last surviving Weston flattener. That was Juicy Payne's boat, and that's in Weston Museum. They were built specially for the shallow waters, so that they could come in on a very, very shallow tide. Normal keel would just make it impossible, and these flatteners were very much the Bristol Channel boats, and this is the last. I don't think any operate now, but this is in Weston Museum. Top right, Coast Guard cottages at Uphill. This is where the Coast Guard was employed to stop people bringing in contraband. It never ever worked. The contraband came in all the time. And the trouble is, the Coast Guard were local people. So they were all, and it was a small place, and hey ho, what does it matter if a few barrels of brandy happen to arrive here? And a wonderful tale of a French lugger coming in to Uphill in the dead of night, dropping anchor and throwing the barrels of brandy overboard with little buoy markers. The idea being then they would just float off on the ebbing tide, and the next morning people would come and collect the stuff. Unfortunately, they're having dropped all these barrels of brandy with the buoy markers, they then upped anchor and didn't move anywhere. The tide had gone out. And then the next morning the Coast Guard rode out on his donkey from Uphill, and there was this French ship in the mud, surrounded by barrels of brandy. There's absolutely no record of the brandy being confiscated or appearing in the Coast Guard ledgers. So perhaps he sold it off to people. And of course the fishing. Those fishing stalls, the sticks, are the stalls. The way of fishing in Weston was you slung the nets over the stalls. The fish came in on the incoming tide, were caught by the gills, and on the ebbing tide they were stuck there. And fishermen would just go out and catch them, bring them in. Huge fishing industry. Stalls are still there. The only problem today is they're not allowed to sell the fish commercially because of rules about we poison ourselves or something. So smuggling, very much part of the thing. The Coast Guard cutters had to hoist the red ensign and the Coast Guard ensign and to tell a ship ahead of it to stop. And Flagstaff Hill in Weston, top of Prince Consort Gardens, was always known as Flagstaff Hill because there was a flagstaff there, and if a smuggling ship was seen in the channel, a flag had to be hoisted to call the Coast Guard cutter, which would then give chase. Now, can you imagine how long that would... Nobody caught anyone. It was just part of the local scene. So, bathing machines. They were invented really at the time of George III. George III, I mean, we all follow what royal people do, and George III really started this habit of going to the sea. He went to Weymouth, and he went to Brighton, and into the water, and people, this is the king doing it, we'd better follow suit, so it became a fashion. Up until then, nobody actually went sea bathing, but it was a bit of a ceremony because the king would only go into the water from his bathing machine. So the bathing machine was wheeled out into the sea, the king would change into it, and he would drop down into the water. And here you can see the king, he was as bald as a coot, but had his wig. So, but on entering the sea, the town band also had to be present in the sea to play God Save the King. So there they were, this deep in water, playing God Save the King as he steps down, swims or paddles or does whatever, and then gets back up, and the band can go. But it became the fashion, going to the sea, and suddenly seaside resorts began to take off. And here in Weston we even tried. This is the Bristol newspaper, Felix Farley's Bristol Journal, the 1780 edition. Here's an advert. For health and sea bathing at Uphill, Jane Bisson's son most respectfully inform the public that they have fitted up 2 commodious houses for the reception of families or single persons during the summer at reasonable terms. 1780. Come to Uphill, not Weston-super-Mare, come to Uphill. Here is another one, 1826. Sea bathing infirmary, or the use of that word, opened at Uphill, quote, affordable relief to diseased objects of charity. What a way now. The trouble is there were too few patients, so it never really... So this was Uphill. Here's a nice picture by William Shepherd of the Ship Inn at Uphill, and they were advertising elegant bathing machines available for company during the season. But very quickly, Weston began to take up the cudgels, and Uphill never really took off as a resort. Weston took over. Here, a painting of 1817 bathing at Anchor Head. Women only. Men were not allowed to bathe within 200 yards of women. It was segregated. At one point, they also tried to segregate it by social status. Though quite how, when you're in the water, you recognise the social status of people, I'm not sure. But here, Betty Mugglesworth from Claremont would come down. She arranged some sort of tarpaulin, and the women could change behind it, into their all-wool bathing costumes. Now, quite what that was like when you got into the water, I don't know. But I think most of them, I mean, we all know what Anchor Head's like. It's not exactly an easy place to swim. I mean, I used to swim there, but I don't any longer. I think it was really an exercise in sort of just getting in the water and feeling better rather than actually striking out to swim a few lengths. Here's a lovely comment, 1804, George Bennett, solicitor at Banwell, referring to Weston. This village is much frequented of late in the summer and autumn for the benefit of sea air and bathing. Several good lodging houses have been lately erected for the reception of company. 1804, so things are developing. Mind you, they were so badly off for provisions that frequently they were obliged to eat bread which was completely turned mouldy, and their substitute for butter was generally liquefied bacon fat. So the gastronomic offerings of Weston were pretty basic. Then we begin to see a new order rising. People with an entrepreneurial spirit who realise tourism is starting, there is potential, let's get on to it. And here we have 4 particularly important players, Richard Parsley, John Cox, James Capel and Richard Fry. They apply to Parliament for the Enclosure Award. Because people traditionally farmed in their strips of land, they let their animals onto the common, it was all very inefficient. And so gradually across England, land was being enclosed, so we had much more efficient, bigger fields, which was great for those who could afford to buy the fields, not very good for the subsistence farmers who were on them. So we began to see a lot of unemployed, former small-time strip farmers. But the Enclosure Award was granted by Parliament West in 1815, and the Auster tenements, which were fishermen's shacks on what today would be the beach and beach lawns, where whenever ships were wrecked, and there were lots of them, lots of timber on the beach, they could build their Auster tenements, and they lived in them by right. Nobody could move them out until the Enclosure Award was enacted, and then they were all cleared out, lock, stock and barrel. One thing, the enclosure, you couldn't just enclose land and benefit from it. There were obligations. If you were going to benefit like these 4 people were, you had to build roads, build bridges, build hedges, build walls. These were part of, it was all laid out in the Enclosure Award. But it brought this land consolidation. Therefore, speculation and entrepreneurial business began really in 1815. There was coincided with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, but also with some pretty poor harvests and depressions. We began to see the opening of hotels. I mean, I told you last week the Royal Hotel opened in 1810. It closed immediately because nobody came to stay in it. But it opened again in 1813, and people were gradually coming. Boarding houses. People, quite wealthy people, in their houses would have extra rooms for the accommodation of visitors. That was quite normal. And then the Great Reform Act of 1832, again, another boost to business, and the real rising of the merchant class, the shopkeepers, the people who were the builders, the people who were doing things, people providing services. The old order was gradually accounting for less, and the new order was pushing its way in. This is the map. I mean, I've improved it from the original drawing, but it's the actual enclosure award. I don't expect you to see it everywhere, but this is part of it. It lays out Watersill Road here, which becomes Locking Road here. This is the road from Ashcombe Gate to the junction with, this is Milton Road today, and its junction with Ashcombe Road. So Ashcombe Road becomes a new road. It is laid out to Uphill. It is the Uphill Drove from Ashcombe Farm to Uphill. And that now today is Drove Road and Devonshire Road. Little bridges have been built. This is the Little Marsh Bridge. Watersill Road here into Big Lamp Corner there. Then a road up to the quarry. The quarry becomes a parish quarry. People can take stone from it to build houses, and that becomes Quarry Road. Jenkins Way, which today would be South Road, Cecil Road rather, and this is Ashcombe Hill Gate, which today would be, this would be Manor Road today, and this would be up to the hill. Now, most of these roads were not actually built, but they are tracks through the woods today. And if you go up the top of Wood Lane, that should have become a road. It never did. It's just a track. A Black Rock Path, which is of course the toll road, all the way to Cewstoke. And this is and Burnback Road, or Burnbeck Road today. And so this is part of the enclosure award of 1815. And here indeed, I mean, you wouldn't recognise it without putting that up there, but this is Quarry Road. The town quarry is up here. These two cottages, Prospect Cottage and, although I forgot the name of the other one, they no longer exist, but this is Queen's Road today, going up to the quarry. The local squirearchy played an important role, but increasingly their business techniques were becoming a bit odd. John Pigott on the left, he was a Francophile. Very, very supportive of everything French. I mean, he loved it. Hence we have a boulevard. It's direct intervention by the family. Though it should be the Pigott Boulevard, but the up-and-coming middle class didn't want it named after the squire, so it just became the boulevard. And then he was succeeded by his brother, Wadham Pigott, who immortalised in Wadham Street. Wadham was a clergyman, his curate at the parish church, and he became really the squire during his brother's absence. It is this man who is responsible for having demolished the medieval village church and building the new St John's Parish Church. And then John Hugh Smith Pigott, who was the bastard son of the Smiths, who married the bastard daughter of the Pigotts, and they became the Smith Pigotts. And he succeeded to the lordship in 1823. And then John Hugh Wadham Smith Pigott, look at those eyes, would you trust that man? Well, he couldn't be at all trusted because he became a Roman Catholic. And in those days, that was tantamount to treachery. I mean, it's sort of amusing nowadays to think of it, but of course we're not far away from the fear of France invading England, and to be Catholic was a bit sort of suspect. Manorial power was gradually diminishing, but they were still important land owners, and certainly much of the Grove Park area was directly developed at their behest. This is the last really important player in the family, Cecil Hugh Smith Piggott. I won't go on about him now because it's way beyond the village, but he as a child had to lay the foundation stone for Burnbeck Pier, and that is the silver trowel which to this day is in Grove House. They wouldn't let his father lay the foundation stone because they didn't actually like him, but they didn't mind 6-year-old Cecil laying it, who, poor lad, had to make a speech in front of several hundred people. But there we are. And last time, I told you the Royal Hotel opened built between 1807 and 1810, and it's this side of it which was the original front of the hotel rather than the present front of the hotel, because nobody built their houses with their windows facing the sea, far too windy. So you built on a north-south trajectory. Now, in the 1832 Reform Act, this is interesting, because this pigsty was built on what is now occupied by numbers 2 and 3 Edinburgh Park North. That pigsty was built by Mr. Parsley, who was a great one of the 4 big developers of Weston. He was very much one for reform, and he penned a little poem which was stuck on this pigsty. This pigsty at Weston was built for 2 ends: to honour reform and give shelter to friends, whilst the mitre above doth triumphantly show the church stands secure, spite of grunters below. So there's this difference of opinion between Anglicanism, Methodism, establishment, challenge. Reform Act was hugely more controversial than Brexit today, but it involved everyone having an opinion. So he built this pigsty. And the Parsley family lived in this house, which is still there. This is their late Georgian house, White Cross House, now heavily hidden by the subsequent Church Hall extension and Victoria Methodist Church, which hides it from Station Road. It's the Church Hall. So there we have Parsley's original White Cross house. All the land around it was the White Cross estate. And of course, it's all no longer visible. But there is the house still there. Richard Parsley, an immensely important player. And that's the house. Meanwhile, Henry Law, Archdeacon, Rector, son, as I said, of the Bishop, does work to enlarge Weston Parish Church, including, of course, putting in their own heraldic glass, stunningly good glass, actually. And here is the rector, and as I said earlier, the family was also the Ellenborough family, the Viceroys of India, so they weren't hard up for a bob or two. I mean, so wealthy was this man that when Weston wanted to build a town hall, or the councillors wanted a town hall, and the townspeople didn't want a town hall, because why should we pay for a comfortable place for you to have your meetings when you've been meeting up until now in a pub? You can carry on meeting in a pub. And Archdeacon Law got so fed up with the vitriol in Weston, he simply said, OK, I'm fed up with you all, I'll solve it, I'll pay for the town hall. And signed a cheque, as it were, or whatever was the equivalent there, and paid for Weston to have a town hall. So here's the medieval village church, which stood until 1824. As I said last time, you can imagine this is Lower Church Road today. That's Grove Park today. Where that church is in this picture is where St John's Church is today. So the new church was built on the same foundations, and that's the new church in 1824. So that horse and cart that's coming down the newly created Lower Church Road, which was built specifically to give a new route into the church. The original road was from Wadham Street up through the fields to the church. So the church did a bit of a land swap, and this road was created. And that's the new church, 1824, and there is a photograph of it before it was extended on the south side when Hans Fowler Price put the 1889 south aisle on. So if you look at those windows and look at those, it's changed. And this, of course, today, the bottom here is Lovers Walk, but you can see these front gardens, Lower Church Road, rather different then from today. And the Parsley family grave in St John's Church, because they were important players. If you were an important player in developing a place, you were also more than likely to be an important person in either church or chapel. That was part of the social life as well. And they hedged their bets. They were in both church and chapel. Of course, people didn't shop. People bought goods from people who made goods or provided goods. Shopping became a modern invention. And we're in as much a revolution now with a change in High Street as people were at that time in the 19th century. Things were changing because of the way people bought goods. And here is High Street. In 1815, it wasn't a shopping street, it was a street where people lived. It was a farming street. Shops weren't there. By 1840, one or two shops were beginning to appear. And you can see it's a higgledy-piggledy street. The first post office was in a place called Clarence House in Regent Street, 1822. And this is wonderful. A chap called Samuel Norville, describing his memories of High Street in 1800. He is saying, there was no High Street, it was called the Street, and very narrow it was too. There was only just room for one putt or cart to pass down it at a time. On the east side there was a ditch, and on the west a hedge banked up with stones to keep the earth back. The street itself was always very muddy and dirty. Some stones were thrown down loosely on one side to make a sort of footpath. Midway there was a withy bed in which refuse fish were generally thrown. You imagine the stink. That would be roughly where Woolworths or Poundland is. Nearly everybody kept geese. They paid so well. You see, they could run about all over the common all day, so it didn't cost much to keep. The feathers were plucked off the live birds once a year, taken to Bristol and other towns to sell. So there's a nice description of what High Street would have been like. Fairlawn House in West Street. Now, try to work out where this might be. The church above will give you some idea. So we're looking up to the church. Fairlawn House no longer exists, but there's nobody in Weston calls the replacement crescent by its proper name of Fairlawn Crescent. There it is. That is Fairlawn Crescent, and that is what it replaced. And just look at those upper stories. This is quality architecture, which I'm afraid, as is typical of so much, what we see on the ground floor is pretty grotty. That's the quality we're talking about. And interestingly, the use of Bath stone comes into its own for the first time when the railway arrives in 1841. Because up until then you couldn't transport stone. You saw this last week. The Hotel Field, looking around to High Street, the Royal Hotel, Bath Hotel, now the Imperial, or now Olive Oil, whatever it's called, South Parade, Waterloo House, knocked down for Waterloo Street, High Street, Veranda House, knocked down for New Post Office, knocked down for the Sovereign Centre. And here, a man called Isaac Jacobs was coming down to Weston, and I'll tell you in a minute why. But beforehand, John Skinner, who was a well-known writer, vicar of a parish in Somerset, he was an archaeologist, and here's another quote from him. Weston seems to be rapidly, 1819, Weston seems to be rapidly increasing, and as long as the whim lasts, it may answer to engage in the speculation of builders and Bristol doctors. But I think that the obstacles are so great to its becoming a permanent place that no one risque too much money in erecting houses for the company. Although Mr. Jacobs, I find, spent upwards of £5,000 in his marine villa, built on the sand facing the muddy estuary, from whence he may contemplate its chestnut-coloured waves, once at least in the day at high water, and the remainder enjoy a wide expanse of dark sunlight. So, Mr. Jacobs below, wealthy Bristol man, the man who creates the Bristol blue glass, decided to come to Weston-super-Mare and built himself a house called Belvedere, which is now the site of this rather architecturally challenging block of flats on the seafront. And this is where he built it. That was the college. Today that is the Grand Atlantic Hotel, Beach Lawns. Where that block of flats is, two big houses, one called Belvedere, north-south trajectory, and behind it one called Sidmouth House, north-south trajectory. These are big houses, and this is where Isaac Jacobs lived. He lost quite a lot of money, and the house was then divided up. It became Mr. L. Wells Academy before he moved into the college, which then in 1889 became the Grand Atlantic. Here is Sidmouth House. And here, thanks to Danny, is a photograph of Sidmouth House before it was pulled down for the bus station. When you came to Weston, what did you do? Well, the people who came in before transport, of course, would have come by stagecoach, and they'd have been happy just walking and wandering and reading. This was the original reading rooms and library. The building is still there. Look carefully. Look at that window formation up and down. It became that, and it's still there. But horrendously uncared for now. But there we have the original assembly rooms, 189 years after they were built. And along the seafront, before the railway arrived, we began to build these two marine crescents of Victoria buildings and Albert buildings. This is what they look like. This is the original became a hotel, the Seaward Hotel. And of course, we can all see what's happened to them. They've gone up a story, and their gardens have come out a story, and that's what they're like today. But we have one left in its Regency style, and that's what the two terraces would have looked like. Then, of course, the railway. The railway changed everything. Great Western Railway, or to start with, the B&E, and this is this wonderful Turner painting. It's called Wind, Fire, Power, and other. And of course, Brunel brings the railway from the Paddington Fields to the Temple Meadow in Bristol. And then, if you want to come to Weston-super-Mare, you got off the train at Temple Meads, you walked across the road, and you caught a train at the next railway station on the Bristol and Exeter line. You couldn't come through. There were two separate railway companies. It wasn't until later the GWR bought out the B&E, and they created today's Temple Mead station. And the population growth figures are interesting. Well, 1801, Weston is clearly the junior partner. 1811, in population terms, is still the junior partner. 1821, it's suddenly overtaken. 1831, it's doubled its population in that decade. Next decade, doubled its population again. It is growing at a rate far greater than we are currently growing. Even though in 10 years' time we'll be larger than Bath, we are still not growing at the same rate as we were doing then. Railway doesn't arrive till 1841. So we were really going ahead before the railway. It's interesting, Weston was on the railway in 1841. Dover, not until 1844. Brighton, 46. We are one of the first resorts to be linked by rail. And who did it? Well, Isambard Kingdom, Brunel, and continued the work with his successor, Francis Fox. And as I said earlier, the result of that was that we could bring in Bath stone for our new buildings. The original railway, as intended by Brunel, was to come across the moor and onto the seafront, and then straight down the seafront with a simple bridge over the River Axe. A bit like today you would find at Dawlish. That was the cheapest way. And Western people wanted the benefit of a railway, but they didn't want the newfangled, smelly, noisy thing actually coming into their nice and up-and-coming village. So they said to Brunel, yes, we want the railway, but you can't actually bring it into Weston. So he was forced to build the line outside Weston. And the added expense, not of a nice simple bridge over the river, but blasting their way through Bleeden Hill, which was hugely expensive. So how to get into Weston? Build another railway line. a junction, single track into the town itself. So you came down the main line, got off the train at Weston Moor, which is where the Burger joint is at the end of Locking Road, at the end of Winstoke Road, and up Winstoke Road into the centre of Weston. And this is Weston's first railway station. It's the only picture we have of it, painted by W.R. Crotch in 1844. Now, if you look carefully, there is one giveaway there, because it is still there. The station doesn't exist, but just look at the building behind the station and see what it says. It's that. It became the Railway Hotel. Go back, look at that roof, and there it is. So you got off the train in what is now Alexandra Parade. There was a hotel, the Railway Hotel. Hotels were always built next to railway stations. Very sensible. And this is it was a horse-drawn train to start with, from the junction station, but very soon this became our brand new high-tech Western train. This was Fairfield, and this picture, it's called Painted from My Window by Henry Taylor, 1846. He must have lived in Magdala Buildings opposite, and here he is sketching. So this is the railway station, built by Brunel. This today is Alexandra Parade Gardens. This today would be the Odeon, and this today would be coming down to Walliscote Road. And look carefully, 3 railway carriages and 2 horses. So this is before we had a steam engine actually there. Fascinating. And that's where the station was. And here's North Star, an actual a scale replica of the engine that came into Weston. It's only a scaled down replica. So go to the Railway Museum and here's a proper one. This is the train that would have come into Weston. Broad gauge, of course, twice as wide as present railway lines. And this is where the track came in. Alexandra Parade Gardens, up here, chug, 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 railway station there, where the floral clock is now. That's why we have this land. Nobody's designed this, it's just a silly roundabout. It's like that because it used to be railway land. The railway pulled out to build a new station here, where Tesco is. That became vacant, and it simply remained wasteland until somebody thought, let's put some grass on it and call it Alexandra Parade, or before that, the plantation. And that's where the track was. That's where the station was. And at the end of it, there was a weighbridge. That's the weighbridge. And if you look very carefully on the roof, what do you see? Carved in the lead, the old weighbridge. And this is taken from the map of 1860. This is the railway map at the time, a map I've got at home, which I've copied. It's interesting, the current plan for a transport hub here, albeit for buses, is simply replicating what was there originally. We have reinvented the wheel. And the land, when the railway moved out to build their new station, where Tesco now is, they parcelled up the land for sale. It wasn't sold, and the council eventually acquired it, and it became a piece of public open space. And that's the original station complex. So, 1841 railway station there. It moves across there, sorry, the 6 has slipped. It moves there in 1866. And this is the 1866 map. Here you've got Alexandra Parade. Here's the new station. So today that would be the Odeon Cinema and Tesco. There's the town hall looking out on it. All of that remained in operation until the loop line was built a bit later. So here we've got photographs of it. And this predates the Odeon Cinema, but you can just see the side. It says the Premier Cinema. That was called the Electric, and it predates the Odeon. And that is the Brunel, that is the second railway station, which was a Francis Fox railway station. That lasted until the war, when it was bombed. What we do have from the original is this. It is the original signal box by the railway station. It's still there. Network Rail's embarrassed by it, they don't know what to do with it, they can't put it down, but it is a listed building built by John Saxby in 1856, and I reckon, Historic England say now, it is the earliest surviving signal box in England. Now I reckon, because we invented the railway system, if it is the oldest surviving signal box in England, I reckon it's the oldest surviving signal box in the world. And what do we do with it? Okay, it's only a signal box, but it's steeped in history. The railway then had to move down to Uphill. This was a problem getting through Bleedon Hill, and so the Irish navvies were employed to blast their way through it. It was a major job, but they did, not without trouble. On one occasion they drank far too much cider, and all the Irish navvies were absolutely pie-eyed. And the magistrate from Uphill, Mr. Tufton Nifton, he was only a short man, but he rode out on his donkey, stood up in the stirrups and read the Riot Act, and they all went back to work. Because 10 years before, the militia had been called out from Horfield Barracks to put down the Bristol riots in 1831, and they killed lots of people with swords. So they knew the last thing they wanted was the cavalry to come down. So they all went back to work. Devil's Bridge. Now I'm beginning to run out of time, but there's how can you begin to run out of time? Going through here, Brunel had great difficulty negotiating the land purchased with the local landowner from Uphill, Mr. Payne. He eventually succeeded, but only on condition, Mr. Payne said, he had to build him a private railway station. So Brunel built a private railway station, only a timber platform, but Payne was such a stupid man, he didn't employ a lawyer. There was never any guarantee that a train would stop at this. So Mr. Payne was often seen on the platform waving his fist at the trains thundering past. Not one train ever stopped. But Brunel got his own back because he had to build this bridge, which is the widest single span elliptical brick bridge in England. It is the highest. The widest is over the Thames, again another Brunel bridge, but it's certainly the highest in Britain. And Brunel, getting the last laugh, thought he would name it after Mr. Payne, the difficult landowner, and called it Devil's Bridge. And we still call it that today. Yes, and there's the widest one, Maidenhead Bridge. So the railway comes, it's broad gauge to start with, the loop line is built, it changes to standard gauge, and that's the system we have nowadays. There you see the last broad gauge train going past Uphill Junction. That's the junction when it had the signal box, and that's what it's like today. At the other end, of course, you came via Whirl, and this is the new line. Whirl, there was a station there then, not the present Whirl station. And this is the system, the last of the broad gauge trains. And here's the new Western Station in 1884. And the staff. And we all know what's happened since. This is the whole railway complex which has now gone. So, finish on this. This is a terribly important 2-year period. 14th of June 1841, the railway arrived in Weston. 13th of May 1842, Weston becomes a town. And this man, not part of the establishment, but Francis Hutchinson Synge, becomes the first chairman of the council, or to give it its correct name, they were called town commissioners. And from that moment on, Weston began to elect people to look after its fortunes. And the following year, we had our first newspaper. This is the Westonian, 1st of April, 1843. So in those 3 years, railway arrives, town has a council, newspaper starts. Everything is changing. So there we move into the ultimate battle, and it is a battle between manorial power. This is Grove House, actually riding to hounds through the centre of Weston, and that's photographed, to democratic at a town hall. So next week then, it's the rise of Weston's merchant class, church versus chapel, education versus ignorance, and the beginning of institutions and public services. So next week, all change. Thank you. And for your homework. Okay then.
Thank you.
Okay then.
I saw the last 60 pictures out in the last 20 minutes. I've seen you remember there, I was like, because you got 152 pictures, you're on about 80, about 20 minutes ago.
Oh right.
Yeah. Done in a couple of weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yes, you're away next week. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, John.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Thanks.
Good.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I won't be here for next week.
Yeah, I'll be in a suit.
Be in a suit.
I'll just slip along the
I'll see you, but not here.
I'll see you there. Right.
Thanks, John.
Now then, I remember where when Tessa
Yes.
and you were saying, I saw that there was the engine.
Yes.
All that.
Yes.
Now then,
Yeah, it's always
before Tesco's was built, that was the old goods yard.
That's it.
And down about
That's it. Yes.
we had
It's what we call.
engineering works there.
It's what we call the goods yard.
Yeah,
But it actually became the second railway station.
yeah.
And then when we built the new one, the present railway station, that second one became the goods yard
Yeah.
and the excursion platform in Locking Road.
Yeah, because company business had engineering
That's it,
hall
yeah.
there,
Yeah.
Thomas Godier's, you know.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, we had the Ernie mechanic.
I got lots of photographs of it, but I knew I'd be pushing time. So So, right, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
it's fascinating. Isn't
Oh,
it?
yeah. But I was because where the family were living
Yes.
in the 18th century. I mean, because Brian Austin was in the family.
Yes.
And I go back, you know.
So, did you know where you were living?
Well, I've got it all just I mean, Porters, Hayes, Sassy, Goliath,
Yes.
Right.
Great stuff. Great stuff.
We started off thinking we're about 29
I'm going on the train, I'm not going to be I'm going on the train. It's too far.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, very interesting. It's wonderful to wander around the town and see and know what
Yeah.
buildings are. It's a bit, yeah. I should look out for them, especially going on the
Trouble is, I get a bit carried away.
Makes it enjoyable.
At the night in Free Storm that you would never imagine. You must come to one of my talks. Museum, haven't we?
He's run me over.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Marvellous. Can't wait for next week now.
And
Did you get that?
I put your name on the photograph as well, so no, one should never presume. So,
Did you get that email
when?
last week?
About a postcard?
The lady outside.
Oh yes, sorry.
You did.
Yeah, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
I didn't reply.
You're
Yes,
terrible at answering emails. Like,
it's just this last week has been chaotic because it's so much work in the town hall.
I don't even want to hear about it.
I'm
There must be a lot of things to get used to because it must all change.
oh, tremendous change because it is a much happier working atmosphere,
Really, that's good to hear.
much happier.
Well, things will get done better.
Council officers,
Because you must have the underlings, like you know, Whitehall's run by the white collar workers, not the politicians, really. Do you have the underlings who go between each parliamentary party and?
well, what was happening before, there was a lot of secret decision making going on.
I remember that being nodded to.
And,
Yeah.
that doesn't happen now. It's partly because it can't happen because no one party runs the council. It's three parties running it.
Right.
It's Lib Dem, Labour, Green and Independence. So 4 lots have got to get on with each other.
Interesting.
It's, and I say to the officers now, I said, if I'm proposing something, I chair the scrutiny panel, I say, if I propose something you think I'm being stupid, I'd far sooner you tell me so, rather than just clam up and
Votes being out, yeah.
So it's a healthier regime, I think.
Gosh, that must give you a bit of a boost.
Yeah, but it's a lot of work. Right. Well, I must get him along
I
to.
wonder what these tables are for. Sorry, what would they do at these things?
They'll sit in work.
There's a workstation.
Yeah. I don't have to. Okay then, all that. Oh, they're a keen lot, I must say, it's good.
Yeah, they all come out very, very enthused, so you must be doing something right.